You know, every life has a hinge moment. A point where the world you thought was solid begins to tremble, quietly at first, until you realize something inside you is calling for a different path. Here, in Existential Moments, we follow those turning points. Those nights of doubt. Those awakenings. Those decisions that reshape a destiny. If you're drawn to stories of transformation, of big thinkers who stepped into the unknown, then settle in. And before we dive deeper, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the channel, where each week, we explore a life that dared to change its course. Now, let me take you to Copenhagen, 1830s. A city of tight cobblestone streets, mist drifting over the canals, and a young man walking alone with his coat collar pulled up against the wind. His name is Søren Kierkegaard, thin, pale, observant, often lost in thought, and carrying more weight on his soul than a man twice his age. When we talk about philosophy today, particularly the great, moody, soul-searching branch we call existentialism, we tend to imagine old men with books stacked to the ceiling, sipping strong black coffee as if it's a spiritual fuel. But existentialism didn't begin that way. It began with a human being, one who was terrified, deeply wounded, and yet strangely courageous. It began with Søren. And what changed him, what forced him to step out of the life he was expected to live and into the life he chose, was not a single event, but a lifetime of moments he later described as fear and trembling. Moments where faith, doubt, love, loss, guilt, and freedom all collided inside him. Let me walk you through that journey. Søren Kierkegaard was born into privilege, financial privilege, at least. His father, Michael, was a wealthy wool merchant. But emotionally? The household lived under a storm cloud. Michael Kierkegaard was tormented by guilt. He believed he had once cursed God as a child, and that every tragedy in their family was God's punishment for that sin. Søren grew up listening to sermons, confessions, and long talks about sin and despair. Be careful, his father would say. Your life can end suddenly. God sees everything. Imagine hearing that every day as a child. Søren absorbed it. He internalized it. And even though he resented it, he also felt bound to it. His future, his talents, his family's expectations, felt like an iron cage. And yet, somewhere in all that darkness, the seeds of his future philosophy were already growing. As a young man, Søren enrolled in the University of Copenhagen to study theology, mostly because that's what was expected of him. But he wasn't satisfied. His real passion was to think, to observe, to question. He spent his days wandering the streets, listening to conversations, writing in journals, and visiting cafes where intellectuals gathered. He wanted to break free, but breaking free meant betraying his father's vision. And that guilt held him in place like thick ropes tied around the soul. The first real rupture came when his father grew ill. Søren watched him decline, and as he did, something shifted inside him. He began to feel a strange mixture of love, duty, and suffocation. His father's final wish was for Søren to become a pastor. But Søren just couldn't. His father's death did not free him, it burdened him. Søren wrote in his journal, "I felt as if a great task was laid upon me." What task? To redefine Christianity itself. To rebuild the idea of faith by burning down the comfortable versions society had built around it. This is where his fear and trembling truly began. But Søren's transformation, his great existential leap, would not come from theology alone. It came from love. Regine Olsen. If you were walking through Copenhagen then, you might have seen her, young, bright-eyed, lively, and full of warmth. Søren adored her with a kind of intensity that frightened even him. She represented a life he desperately wanted: happiness, companionship, a home, children, laughter. For a time, he let himself believe he could have that life. He proposed. She accepted. But something didn't sit right in Søren's soul. Something old. Something shadowed. The guilt he inherited from his father, the fate he believed he couldn't escape, the sense that he was destined for a different life, a life of writing and suffering. He convinced himself that Regine would be happier with someone else. He believed he would ruin her life. So he did what would forever wound them both. He broke off the engagement. Just imagine that scene. A bright young woman, confused and heartbroken. A man pacing the room, trembling with regret even as he speaks the words. Breaking her heart became the great wound of his life, and also the catalyst for his philosophy. To understand why, you need to understand what came next. After leaving Regine, Søren plunged into a storm of emotional and spiritual turmoil. He didn't just feel sad, he felt existentially torn apart. What he had done seemed unforgivable. The pain and contradiction inside him needed an outlet. So he wrote. He wrote like a man possessed. Sometimes he wrote for 15 hours a day. Sometimes he wandered the streets in the rain, muttering to himself, searching for clarity. This is when he created the work that would later define him. Fear and Trembling. It's a strange book. Fierce. Tender. Conflicted. Its central question is this. How do you make a choice when both paths require you to sacrifice a part of your soul? Søren used the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, the terrifying moment where Abraham prepares to sacrifice his own son because he believes God commanded it. Kierkegaard didn't interpret the story literally. Instead, he used it to explore something universal. Every one of us will face a moment where we must choose between what makes sense and what feels necessary. Between the ethical and the absolute. Between safety and a leap of faith. His own, Abraham moment, was breaking off his engagement with Regine. The pain he caused. The love he lost. The uncertainty that consumed him. That was his sacrifice. That was his trembling. Fear and Trembling wasn't an abstract intellectual work. It was a confession. A scream. A philosophical love letter to the woman he believed he could never have. While other philosophers sought fame in universities, Søren became an outsider. He never married. Never took a professor's post. Never joined an academic circle. Instead, he walked the streets alone, his cane tapping on the cobblestones, becoming both a familiar and ghost-like figure in Copenhagen. People mocked him for his strange clothes, his hunched posture, his intense stare. Children followed him, laughing. He was lonely, yes. But he was also free. Free to question society's norms. Free to challenge the church's hypocrisy. Free to argue that truth is not something you learn, it's something you live. This belief would become one of the foundations of existentialism. Søren considered his era shallow and dishonest. He believed society was filled with people who cared more about looking virtuous than being virtuous. So he wrote book after book after book. Either/or. The concept of anxiety. The sickness unto death. Stages on life's way. Works of love. Each one a mirror held up to the human soul. And each one returning to the same question. What does it mean to live authentically? To Søren, it meant standing alone, without the safety of crowds, without the comfort of collective belief, and taking personal responsibility for your choices, your faith, your failures, and your freedom. It meant embracing the uncertainty of life and walking forward anyway, even when trembling. Toward the end of his life, Søren waged a very public battle with the established church. He believed Christianity had become too easy, too soft, too concerned with rituals and respectability instead of actual spiritual struggle. He wrote damning critiques of the clergy. Newspapers mocked him. Old friends distanced themselves. He grew more isolated. His health worsened. He collapsed in the street in 1855 and died shortly after, at only 42 years old. When he died, his books were not widely read. His influence seemed small. But the seeds were planted. Decades later, long after his lonely funeral, Søren's writings were rediscovered. Thinkers like Heidegger, Sartre, Camus, and even modern psychologists saw in his work a vision of the human soul unlike anything before it. They saw a man who understood that life is uncertain, that choices can wound us, that love can break us, that faith often requires a leap, that humans live in moments of fear and trembling, yet still push forward. And that authenticity is the courage to stand alone in the storm and still choose your path. Kierkegaard didn't just create existentialism. He lived it. Every day. Every heartbreak. Every word on every page. His life was his philosophy. His philosophy was his confession. And his confession became a revolution. If Kierkegaard's journey moved you, if stories of transformation resonate with your own inner battles, then I invite you to stay with us. This is Existential Moments, where lives pivot, where destinies shift, and where ordinary people step into extraordinary change. Don't forget to follow and subscribe. Because every week, we unfold another turning point, another moment where a human being faced their fear, their trembling, and still chose to leap.